You should know better. You know my conflict. All right, everybody. Well, welcome. Sit your booty down. Welcome. We have really grown this week. I'm grateful that people came back and we even grew. So I guess I didn't ruin it. Yeah, no pressure though. Why don't we start just quickly going around this way, and let's do some names just for those that might not know everyone in the room, and then we'll say a prayer and then we'll get started. How's that sound?
I'm Mary Parrish Coley.
Janet Rosenberg. Jerry Warner.
Liz Ward. Some names, can I make one up?
Sure.
Hey, Tommy.
Bruce Chapman. Yeah, Bruce Chapman.
Mary Chapman.
Mary Gertner.
John Gertner.
Justin Perry.
Mariana Marley. Kelly McAllister.
Paul Petticoat.
Lee Petticoat. Karen Willis. Serenity Taylor.
Casey Umber. Jody Lowry.
And I'm Shay Watts. Wonderful. Prayer request tonight. We'll be praying for Justin's father passed away 2 days on Sunday. So and we talked yesterday. He wanted to be here tonight, but let's just keep him and your family in our prayers. I'm so sorry.
You could also have my stepdad, David. He's in the hospital with double pneumonia right now.
Wow. David?
I have a celebration. My nephew is getting married Saturday.
Okay.
It's a very tiny wedding. I'm not invited, but there's only like 6 people that have been invited. That's what they say.
Is the praise that he's getting married or that you don't have to go?
No.
Yeah, when I get invited to weddings, oh, don't make me do it. What's his name? Garrett. We'll give thanks for Garrett Saturday wedding.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Lovely. Anybody else? All right. Let's pray. Holy Lord, thank you for this beautiful group of people, this church where we can come together and have conversations, to be able to see and to listen and also be heard. We thank you that you're here with us. We ask that you guide our conversations, and as we learn and listen to each other, that our love for each other and for you would deepen, and that we may leave this place and space with more tools and perhaps more boldness to have crucial conversations, because we know that you are never absent from us, even in our difficult conversations. So help us tonight as we learn, as we grow, that we may apply what we're learning, that we may live and step up and be the church you call us to be at this time and place. We have many things on our hearts that weigh heavily, that pull us down, the things we grieve, things we have named here in this space, and things we've left unnamed. And today we want to continue to pray for Justin's family, the passing of his father. We just ask, as he grieves and plans and thinks about next steps and even teaches tonight, may he feel a sense of your love and care and concern in this time, that the church, the people, friends, family would find ways to support and surprise him and his family as they grieve and as they take it day at a time. We also pray right now for Liz's stepdad, David, who's in the hospital with double pneumonia. We commit David to your care. We ask for wise doctors and effective medications and medical interventions and nurses and chaplains and everyone in that situation, that you would give them a sense of your presence with, that on the highest mountain tops and even in the lowest valleys, God, you are there with us. We give you thanks for a wedding that's coming up, Mary Parrish's nephew, and we just ask for a wonderful ceremony with these 6 other people that are there, and we ask for that you would bless the union of Garrett, and we ask these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. I didn't ask about your brother and sister-in-law.
They're doing good.
Okay.
Thank you for prayer.
All right.
Of course, she's gonna say that now, man.
I know, it's like, God's okay with addendums to prayer. Zoom is going, is someone on?
No, we just
Okay.
wondered if it was on.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah, it's on.
So, glad to be here with all of you tonight. So, when Shay, Catherine, and I talked about this series, they told me that they were planning to do a series on crucial conversations and recognizing, obviously, the challenges that are in front of us, the divisions that are in front of us, and things like that. And so we kind of talked about how to approach it. And one of the things that I thought was important was to kind of have a progression. Because I think sometimes what we think is like, okay, there's a problem. All right, I'm just gonna jump in and solve it. And again, my analogy is lots of times we want to act as, certified surgeons when we haven't taken intro bio, right? And a lot of us don't realize we don't even know intro bio because we assume we do, right? And so, one of the things we thought was important was just to frame, why they're necessary in the first week. Today, we're going to talk some about some of the history that's led us here. And again, obviously, that is so deep that we can't capture it all here. And so actually, even in putting together slides, I kind of made a decision that I was still going to put things in here that we may not be able to fully talk to tonight so that people can come back to things. Because I think it's important for us to be lifelong learners in this, right? The following week, we're going to talk about what it's like to navigate the emotions that come up for us, because that's a large part of it. Sometimes our emotions prevent us from engaging. Sometimes our emotions make it difficult to engage and to do it effectively. But as part of the work is figuring out how to recognize what they are, but also how to work through them in a healthy way. Then we're going to actually talk about the actual skills of carrying it out, because there is a skillful approach to conversations. And sometimes it's also important to recognize that all audiences aren't the same. And there's some conversations that I can have here, but then some places where this actually isn't going to be an honest conversation. So I might have to preserve my energy for a space where there can be one. Does that make sense? Because sometimes we wrestle with people who want to wrestle but don't want to move forward, and we no longer have energy to actually have conversations that could be productive, right? And then the last one is actually looking at how do we grow individually as well as collectively once we've had these conversations that sometimes are going to be uncomfortable. And a lot of times, especially if we do them effectively, it probably will be uncomfortable, right? But also we can still work through that discomfort in a healthy way, okay? So tonight, again, we're talking to them about history. And so the assumptions we go by, this is for the entire series, but obviously there's some people who weren't here, but I think it's still good just as a reminder for even folks who are here. So one of the things that we want to start is that we all believe that somebody's demographics should not fade them to negative outcomes, right? One of the things we also want to recognize is that crucial conversations are often uncomfortable, right? Separately, we also have to recognize that creating discomfort without providing effective strategies is not necessarily productive, right? So we want to figure out how we find ways to move forward. The last one I think is very important. I think it's very important for us, and I can say this to you all as my Presbyterian brethren, right? In attempting to do this, we will make mistakes. And I have to say that because lots of times there's this pursuit of perfection that often prevents any kind of movement for us, if that makes sense at all, right? So we have to recognize that mistakes are going to be made. And the question is kind of like recovery languages, how do I do the next right thing, right? So that's how we operate. So the agreements that we have for this series of classes, including tonight and moving forward, is that we want to create brave spaces to exchange, learn, and be vulnerable, right? We want to create a space where we can be brave, right? We want to speak truth with integrity, and we want to resist sarcasm and trolling. That doesn't mean we can't use sarcasm at all, because obviously I've already done it, and I was going to do it again when she said sits, and like, it's probably 600 people who are coming, but I'm just going to always make it advice. But in these conversations, one of the things that's important though is, especially if I'm dealing with somebody who's dealing with something that's very vulnerable to them, and I'm looking at it as an opportunity to troll and kind of have fun at their expense, That's not actually healthy dialogue. But that's also something that we do have a lot of going on in our society right now, right? So we have to name that. Third thing, we want to lean into discomfort, but also lean into each other for support. Again, you're going to notice I keep saying again, none of us are entitled to comfort. And I kind of have to say that out loud, right? Because as we go through this history, what we'll see is that a lot of people have not been entitled to comfort. And so it's recognized that if we actually want to move forward, I have to accept that some things are going to sting sometimes, you know, but that's why we call them growing pains. We want to commit to non-closure. Again, we want to recognize that this stuff has happened over time, which means it's going to take time to move forward. But that doesn't mean we don't still also act with urgency, right? So again, but it's also recognizing that because I have one conversation and it doesn't go well, it's like, oh, well, I tried, right? You know, so it's saying that, again, this is going to take work, right? So again, we're committing to that. I always think this was a very important, when we're having these conversations with each other, we want to assume positive intent, but we want to practice what I call compassionate accountability. And compassionate accountability means is that we didn't create the society that we're in, but we all are now a part of it and have inherited it, right? How you doing? So again, with compassionate accountability, with the language I often say, again, I don't really focus on calling somebody, quote unquote, a sexist, a racist, a whatever else, because people use that as a distraction. Like, if Shay said to me, you calling me racist? I'm like, no, I'm calling you Shay. I'm only calling you your name, right? Only thing I care about is, do you care about eliminating the disease of racism, of sexism, of homophobia, right? Do you want to get rid of those ills? How you identify does not matter to me. If I bring the Grand Dragon of the Klan in here, they're going to tell me they're not racist. So why am I going to argue with you about that? A lot of times we get stuck on that and we don't move forward. Does that make sense at all? All right. Now, to get to a place where I am, like I can call myself a recovering sexist, a recovering xenophobe, a recovering all these things, but that's because I'm comfortable where I am in that space. I know I've done all these things. But for your purposes, it's more worried about, am I actually addressing the issue? And then the last thing is, we're going to keep learning. You're going to keep learning. My favorite team growing up, football, before the Panthers was here, was the Washington Redskins. You know, and I remember I said something about the Redskins, my son was like, Commanders, Dad, and I was like, yeah, no. Right? You know, I didn't go into who the Redskins when I first watched them, that's what they're always going to be. Right? And that's a very simple example, but the truth is there's so much progression that happens, and part of the work is being open to evolving, if that makes sense. All right. So Shay, we always start off with some scriptures.
So one of the, you may remember last week, we started with some scripture and thinking about conflict even within the scriptures. And I was thinking about it for this week as we think about scripture and tradition and the sort of historical interpretations of it. I wanted to bring our attention to Ephesians, which is a letter. It's a contested letter of Paul, meaning we're not quite sure he wrote it, but someone who knew Paul very well either wrote it pseudonymously or as Paul, or maybe Paul dictated some of it or whatever. But what I want to draw our attention to is, so in chapter 4, so the writer's talking to the church and sort of admonishing them and instructing them, and says, therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry. It doesn't say do not be angry, right? It says in your anger, it's almost presupposing, right, that we talked about conflict as the etymology being strike together. We're going to strike together. But in our anger, not letting the sun go down on it, it gives us an opportunity, gives us time so that we can speak truthfully to our neighbor, to our colleague, and even to ourselves. And so I wanted to talk about that and frame this. Last week, we talked about Jesus being asked, how many times do I have to forgive someone? Like 7 times? And what does Jesus say? A lot more than that, right? 7, like 1 each day, right? It's like a mulligan. I get, everyone gets a mulligan once a day. Jesus is like, no, exponentially, right? much, much more. We have to be willing to forgive. And so I would say, when it comes to speaking truthfully, sometimes that doesn't feel very good. Whether we're angry or nervous about it or defensive, and we're instructed that in our anger, to let it be somehow constructive. And so this is a challenge, but I wanted to offer it as we think about now our history and how we have conversations together.
And actually, like you lifting this one up, because one of the things that I often talk about when we talk about history and everything else is that a lot of this stuff is traumatic. And for some of you who don't know, I work as a therapist. And so for the past 20 plus years, my career has been working with people dealing with trauma. And one of the symptoms of trauma is anger, right? And yet very often when people are dealing with these vulnerable things, you're like, oh, if you aren't so angry, I'd listen to you. Right? And yet, as a man, I ran a group for women, all with severe trauma. Again, I was the only man in there. And they often would talk about challenges they have with men and the ways they've been wrong and things like that. And they were often very heated. But at no point did that ever say, I could hear you all, ladies, if you were a little less angry. That wouldn't have played out very well, do you think? Right? So just think about that with when we do things, or whether it's in the spaces of other demographics and things like that, right? So, it's funny, this is often attributed to James Baldwin, but it's actually a guy, Robert Jones, who has this quote, right? And it's, we can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. So I'll say it again slowly. We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. Right? There's some things where we just say, hey, we agree to disagree. But if it's talking about somebody's right to exist, that's kind of hard to just agree to disagree on. Are we following that? And so I think when we have some of these conversations, it's important to recognize that again, you know, when Shay and I talked about it before, sometimes when we have conversations, we are like this. But sometimes there are differences, right? If I'm having a conversation with somebody who's experienced sexual trauma and I've not experienced it, for me to sit there and kind of look at us as peers and make them have to prove themselves to me, are y'all following that?
Yeah.
And so I think it's just important as we kind of go through this. Sometimes what happens is people feel like their humanity is put on trial, right? Right. So again, the exact opposite of what Jesus taught us. Like, it's just unconditional. But a lot of us, sometimes are sitting around, if it's not what I'm experiencing, well, I'm trying to determine, do you really have the right to exist? Do you have the right to exist freely? So again, how the division started, again, goes deeper than this, but at the same time, we should take this 5-minute video in, and this is going to talk just a little bit about our history here. Once folks came to this land, and I won't say any more because I don't want to spoil anything. So.
Give me 1 second to make sure I'm sharing also the audio. Speaker. Okay, let's try it. Is it playing? Come on.
So it started very slowly.
It started so slowly. Hold on. Give me 1 second here. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it started.
Something changed.
Something changed.
Let's try this. Give me 1 second here. See if this will fix our situation.
It's not on the screen. Yeah.
Yeah, I got you. So,
Pull up the email to you.
I have it here. The problem is, I'm sharing my extended, hold on.
Oh, there you go. You got it.
You know, we'll figure it out one way or the other.
Move it a little further. There you go.
But in terms of our early stages, whiteness, as we understand it, race, as we understand it, didn't exist. That may be hard to understand now because it's so prevalent. Everybody seems to have a race. But race actually came into being, and we can trace that being. And much of the formation of how we think about race came out of the New World. That is, when people came to the Americas from Europe. And there were people from Africa, and there were people from Europe, and there were the elites. And of course, there were the people who are already here, the native people. And the elites tried to organize the people from Africa, the workers from Europe, indigenous workers, and the native people to actually control them, to extract resources from them. And at some point, the people from Africa and the people from Europe decided to make common cause. They lived together, they worked together, they intermarried, they had children. It wasn't perfect, but there probably was much more what we would call interracial contact then than there is now. And it didn't seem odd at all. And at some point, it occurred to them that, look, we're doing all the work. We have no control over our lives. So there's this rebellion called the Bacon Rebellion, where they rebelled against the elite. And they demanded land, and they demanded greater democracy. They demanded the right to participate in the governance of the colony. And the elites rejected that. And this rebellion, and the rebellion was quite successful, called the Bacon Rebellion. The elites responded by saying, look, we have too many workers, and if they work together in a common cause, it's going to be hard to manage them. So they tried to experiment with separating the Africans and Europeans. And it took them almost 100 years. They tried religion, they tried language, they tried place of origin, and they stumbled upon race. Now they couldn't start with race because race didn't exist. So they couldn't just think of it. They had to experiment. And they started passing new laws like anti-miscegenation laws. And they told the now newly minted whites that your role is to identify with the elites. You're not an elite yourself. You should identify with the elites, and you should police the non-whites. And they create slave patrols. But also, they created a new identity, white identity. It had not existed before. And the white identity was that middle stratum, that stratum of identifying with the elites and controlling the non-whites. And it's important in terms of saying this that the elites didn't think of themselves as white. Yes, they were Europeans, but they thought of themselves were the elites. And because there's been this history where whites were so close to what was then blacks, there's always a fear that you might fall back into that space. So there's always this anxiety. An early definition of whites were defined in terms of not being black. It was a negative definition. Interesting, the Bacon Rebellion, Bacon himself was white, but it became known as a rebellion driven by blacks because they're trying to create a sense of blackness being scary and somehow a threat to whiteness. What's important in terms of this history is that whiteness itself never was the top dog. There was always the elites. So when we look at understanding race today in the economy, we sometimes think in terms of whites and non-whites, or whites and blacks, Latinos, others. And it has some currency, that's real. But missing from that formulation are the role of the elites. And the colonies, Virginia being the most important, was a corporation. So Virginia was literally owned by a corporation and governed by a corporation for the crown to extract as much resources as possible from people, from land. And to some extent, that formulation we still live with today, even though it's been updated.
Any initial thoughts?
I've never really heard it put exactly like that. I think that's really interesting.
How many of y'all remember learning about Bacon's Rebellion in school growing up? About Bacon's Rebellion that they were talking about?
I do.
See? She went to a special school. She went to one of those woke schools. But I mean, notice how few of us said that though.
Yeah.
I mean, why do you think that is? We learn a lot of history. Yeah, just,
Wasn't a value to them, so it's just the.
so it's something to think about, right? And so, yeah, I think one of the things when we talk about this, and with a lot of this work, there was a creation of a hierarchy, right? And the hierarchy was a necessary part of doing business. Because again, we talked right there, you were talking about the corporation, right, the crown, right? And that was the work. And so part of the work was creating laws that advantage white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, male landowners. All right. And I think it's important that like you have to recognize each of those pieces, right? So obviously you have white, which is race, but did anybody hear how they define white in the video?
Not black.
Not black. That's the definition. And it makes sense because I do trainings all around the country. And so we're doing things, again, groups like this, but I'm in California with various, Latino, Hispanic communities. We're dealing with folks who may have migrated from India, Africa, and things like that. And there is still a recognition of not being identified as black as a goal. Are y'all following that? So again, recognizing there, so white is the race piece, Anglo-Saxon, right? So again, we're looking now at ethnicity, we're looking at nationality, we're looking at language. And again, so you can see the evolution of folks like the Irish and the Italians, things like that. At first, that's what they were, but eventually they became white, right? Germans, so I changed a letter or two of my last name so I can roll myself into this. Are y'all following that?
Mm-hmm.
That P on there, Protestant. What's Protestant?
Yeah.
Not Catholic, right? Us, the right kind of Christian, right? But again, so not Catholic mattered at that point because we didn't have enough other diversity religion-wise that we could actually discriminate against the Catholics. But once we started having the other religious discrimination, then it just became Christian. Male, so gender, sexual orientation, again, right kind of male, right? And then this last one is very important. Landowners. Who are the landowners? Yeah, but also, but go deeper with that. Who are the landowners? Elite, right? And that's the tricky part right there. Because a lot of the white men were still poor, working class, whatever else. So again, when you talk about even being able to hold office, being able to vote, all those things like that. So again, to that point, you're doing the work of the elite, but you're not quite there. But you feel like you're that close to it, so who do I align with? Right? But at that time, that was the whole point with the Bacon thing, was recognizing actually, man, we're working together, we're not getting enough. Right? And so they came together, and then all of a sudden, the elite recognized that. We had something similar happen here in North Carolina. Anybody know what I'm talking about in the late 1800s? Something similar? Somewhere headed east.
Wilmington?
Wilmington.
Yeah.
So again, what had happened there was now all of a sudden you have new free black men able to vote, run for office, and they actually, the working class white men, there was this fusion party because they had shared economic interests, and all of a sudden they gained power. And see, that's exactly what happens when you start talking about these things. Right, you know, yeah, it's like, all right, you're going too far, buddy. I thought it was gonna be quicker, man. I'm not gonna lie. And so, and so again, they voted together. All of a sudden, that elite that was doing government for themselves lost power. And so all of a sudden, they were like, well, we're gonna take it back by force and by violence. And they did. And not only did they stop by violently removing folks and everything else, they created voter suppression laws to make it harder for that to happen again. Are we following that? And these kinds of things aren't always relevant anymore, right?
Yeah, one of the things I think is interesting is class often gets left out of a lot of these conversations when we talk about intersectionality, but it's so, so important. And I think we need to look no further than like our tax laws, because like they are historically benefit land and business owners. The sort of tax incentives and breaks you get versus the, you know, sort of a more working class person.
So,
Yeah, it's just continued all these 250 years.
Yeah.
It's the very same now as it was then.
Tax policy is social policy.
so I worked for about 2.5 years in Stanley County, and, you know, 80% white, rural, poverty, my clients and everything else like that. At that point, we were, I mean, this is between 2009 and 2011, and, you know, ground zero for opioid epidemic. You know, I mean, #1 per capita in overdoses in the state, top 10 in the country. Their fentanyl was there before it was here, right? And I remember doing an assessment with a guy one time, and his treatment was paid for completely by the county and by the state, and his income was disability income. And in the middle of our assessment, he says to me, he's like, man, I just can't stand these people getting these government handouts. And I remember just being like, I'm a clinician right now, not an activist, right? But like my brain said, my friend, without government handouts, you couldn't afford me. I mean, heck, I couldn't have afforded me then, right? And but again, it helped me realize the genius of this thing called race.
Yeah.
Because he assumed that's what people who look like me got. He didn't recognize that without that quote unquote government assistance, he would be bankrupt from his medical bills and eventually homeless. Are y'all following that?
Yeah.
So again, when we talk about that, I always start with that video for that reason. Right? I know this is the test of the eyes, right? Yeah.
What's the lowest thing you can read?
Man, that's because I thought we had like 80-inch screens in here. What happened, Covenant? Come on.
Man, budget
What's going
cuts,
on?
man.
This budget looks different now. All right, so here, I'll give y'all a few things on here. So there's one thing you can obviously see, even if you can't read all the dates, what's one thing you can see?
I can see it
Slavery
all.
is a big piece, right? Now, so 1619, we're talking about the first African brought here. 1641, there's a legislature that authorizes slavery. Can anybody say which legislature that is?
Massachusetts.
Massachusetts. You know, Malcolm X has a quote that says, you know, anything below Canada is the South.
Yeah.
You know, because people are like, well, I'm not from the South. I'm like, well, what does that mean to me? Right? You know, it's like, you're from a state where there's nobody that looks like me in it, right? And so, but how does that happen? Right? And so again, like we have these ideas that it's like, there's something culturally different about people there versus there. You know, we did training out in Oregon. And whenever we do trainings, we always study the place before we go there because we talk some about the history there as well. And there's more Black folks in Mecklenburg County than the entire state of Oregon. And it's not a coincidence. It actually was created, and the words we use, that's what I love about history, is they just were honest with the words back then. Like the goal was to create a white utopia. And even though they did not have slavery, they had a law that as a Black person, if you stayed there for more than 48 hours, you could be given lashings until you left. Are y'all following that? So sometimes when we have these conversations about what's different out there, it's different out there, and I'm like, so how many people out there look different than you, right? And so it's just recognizing these kinds of things. So Homestead Act. Anybody heard of Homestead Act? What do y'all know about the Homestead Act?
Westwood expansion, look.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's
How
right.
they colonized the
Yeah,
west,
yeah,
the Mississippi.
yeah. Land.
Land, yeah.
Who could get land?
White men.
European immigrants, right? European immigrants, right? So even Africans that had been there generations could not get it, right? So again, they could not purchase land because they were not considered citizens. And I was following Dred Scott. When Dred Scott tried to run for free land, but it's like, but you're still not a citizen. So again, what is one of the main ways that we create wealth in our society?
Land ownership.
Land ownership, passed down equity, right? And so when we talk about the generational wealth,
Passing on.
right? Again, these things are not accidents. So 1865, we know the Civil War, 1917, we see these racially restricted covenants being used within private housing contracts. You know, even one of the deeds, my house said it's supposed to be sold to someone of the Caucasian race, right? So again, our neighborhoods don't just magically end up that way. This is around the country. 1934, you know, redlining is allowed by the FHA. And everybody knows what redlining is? All right, who can speak to what redlining is?
It's exactly what you're talking about, what's in the deed, who's allowed to buy property. You know, and they put barriers up such that it's not accessible to blacks or to the poorest of the poor.
Yeah, well, and banks would, in their credit risk guidelines, where they were allowed or not allowed to make loans, they literally took maps, they redlined areas that were African American communities and said, you can't get a loan there.
Yeah. And so you see these kinds of things. So home ownership, business ownership, interesting thing. When you talk about even as we get more modern, where a lot of black neighborhoods, black folks not be able to get loans to get in there, people who are immigrants who were not able to have businesses in white communities were able to get loans in black neighborhoods. Are y'all following that? And so you have these interesting dynamics at play where especially if you go out west and things like that, LA, you'll see it's like the Korean owned this and everything else in the black neighborhoods, but lots of times not as many black owned businesses there. And to the point that Liz made, and if you study even our history, it wasn't always made based on your actual economics. Like it was actually based on the fact that we see this person as trustworthy and we see this person as less trustworthy. The real estate folks actually ranked which demographics were safest to lend to and everything else like that. And that was when it was breaking down through the Europeans. But if you look at Mecklenburg counties, you'll see at the bottom, it was Mexicans and Negroes, right? So again, thinking about how we are where we are. So 1964, we got the Civil Rights Act. So again, that's the first time. So again, 1920, women got the right to vote, meaning white women, right? It wasn't until the 1960s that black women got the right to vote. Like, so my mom turned 18 in 1968. So she was part of like one of the first classes of black women to vote. Are y'all following that? So when we talk about, man, so long ago, right? You know, but again, it's important that we that goes back to the intersectionality piece too, right? Because again, when we talk about women's suffrage, we're really talking about white women's suffrage, but the black women didn't have the right. In the same way that black men got the right to vote at the end of the Civil War, the black women didn't. Are we following that? So
It's very important for me to realize that slavery lasted for 400 years. And how many generations is that?
yeah. Well,
So you've got this ingrained inheritance of a system.
Yeah.
You don't just flush it overnight.
no. Well, and here's the great nuance about it, right? So even if you read the 13th Amendment, and because I had so many slides, I was like, and I don't want to get through, I'll often put that on there and I'll send it to you. If you read the 13th Amendment, as it says, there's an important caveat in there. So again, it says that slavery is illegal, essentially, except in the case where someone has been duly convicted of a crime. So is slavery actually illegal? No, it's not. That's what, so again, if you're convicted of a crime, the way our Constitution is written, if you read the 13th Amendment, I'm gonna let you Google it, Shay, and put it on you to Google it, so then
Okay.
we'll look at it in a second.
Okay.
And so you can read the words exactly as it is. You can scroll up on your phone, you know,
Okay, yeah.
and we'll read it out. So, this is an important one. So 2014, we taught Michigan ban on affirmative action in college admissions. Then obviously we have Sutherland, Chapel Hill. Now, so it talks about using race is what we're banning. What's not banned is using legacy. Are y'all following that? In 1999, I was already a nerd. We had to do senior essay projects. My senior essay project in 1999 as a senior at West Charlotte was on the real affirmative action in college admissions, legacy admissions.
Mhm.
Because if you look at a school like Harvard with like a 3% admission rate, once you go into legacies, that admission rate is like 35 to 40%.
Yeah.
But again, no one's battled that one. We battled the racial piece.
All right. 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction.
Keyword, except,
Except as.
right? Conjunction, junction, what's your function? Right? So, few other important dates. 1790, this is an important one as we have the immigration conversation. That was the first time we had actual US citizenship. The Naturalization Act created US citizenship for free white persons of good character. I saw you said, yeah, Terry, you're not a good character, man. So, no, I know. So I know we're not supposed to be sarcasm. But again, but the thing is, again, they wrote it directly in there. Are you following that? So again, so when we say, well, my great grandparents or whoever else did it the right way. Well, that's because they were part of the group who was allowed to come in. More than likely, they were doing the same thing. Right? Again, I mentioned 1920 with the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote. 1963 Equal Pay Act looking to address wage discrimination between men and women. So part of why I'm pointing these things out too, some of these other things is whenever there's movement of progress towards groups who've historically been excluded, it is often felt as a threat by those who have been on the receiving end of the power. Does that make sense? So women voting, women fighting for better wages. 2008, Barack Obama elected first and only non-white male president. I always have to name this, and I tell people, regardless of who you vote for, whatever else like that, we have to name the birther movement. Yeah. We have to name that. Have we ever had a birther movement for any other president that we've had? Right? And so again, that's important to recognize. So we have to recognize there's cultural things. There's cultural things that we talk about. 2015, legalization of same-sex marriage. Again, for a lot of people, that created discomfort. Are we following that? Terry, I'm pretty sure you and I were on session then when we voted to allow gay marriages to take place here at Covenant, right? And that there was wrestling that happened.
Yeah.
Are y'all following? So this is not limited to a year, but the phrase, y'all ever heard the phrase, the browning of America?
Oh, yeah.
Right. So again, once we no longer were just taking these folks in terms of immigration, and we started having folks who we identified as brown. They may or may not identify as brown, just to be clear. I think that's the other thing, is some people are like, oh, let me put Latino folks in a box that they may not put themselves in. Well, I'm gonna identify as white, and identify as black, again, because race and ethnicity are not the same, right? But again, that phrase, and there was constant talk of this point where white Americans are no longer gonna be the majority. Again, did that create energy in our country?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, now again, and again, I can recognize, like, I know I am not part of the 50% in this room right now, right? But at the same time, when and there has been a world that's been created that says, this is what it should look like for me, and it's like, oh my God, this is gonna happen. Again, just to be clear, 50% is still a lot. But it mobilizes energy, mobilizes fear. And this last thing, again, because I can't give enough actual, when I do this, I give a whole long time to, it's important for us to recognize that our foundation was built on indigenous genocide in pursuit of land. Are we following that?
Funded by the church and theologically justified for, the doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny.
And also by corporations.
Oh, yeah, it still is.
All
Greenland, let's go.
of it. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe.
Again, there's a reason why Protestant is listed in here, right? The idea that the church is somehow absent of this is not a reality.
The Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism.
Yeah.
You know, the book about.
Yeah, Max Weber.
Yeah. And again, think about that though. And I think the other thing is important to recognize when we talk about Protestants. So again, because again, our elite laws were created. The funny thing is, as much as we broke away from England, we tried to repeat a lot of England. You know, and again, even the law in terms of citizenship was patterned after England's, which was done on settling Protestants. And they saw Protestants as white Christians, and it was a way of saying not Muslim folks. That's from 1740, right? And so just recognize that again, the Middle Ages, all the torture and things like that was happening, you had people fleeing to this land. A lot of them fleeing from brutality, fleeing the plague, fleeing poverty. Why do a lot of people flee to America? What do people flee from?
Persecution.
The same things people flee from then. Right?
War.
Yeah, right? I want to give this little nuance here, all right? And I'm gonna do a speed ahead because I'm always gonna make sure you all have some chances to talk. It's gonna try me, all right?
Censor.
Got two to work with, all right? So again, this is one of the things that's important, and I'm gonna say this, lots of times I hear people say, well, the Irish were slaves too. And so I'm gonna just say lovingly, was not the same thing. The Irish were indentured servants who were exploited, but they were not Protestant chattel slaves.
They also spoke English.
Sure.
And they had white skin.
They
Yeah,
purchased
well,
their freedom.
But that was part of the separation of treatment, right?
Yeah.
So I think the important thing to recognize is, so when you think about folks coming over, here you have folks that are fleeing persecution, tyranny, and war. They were allowed to keep their language, their religion, their stories, their symbols, right? Maintain the rights to their children. Very significant, all those things are very significant. So when people talk about the history and everything else like that, the same way that we connect to the Scottish folks here and everything else like that, right? Black people kidnapped, transplanted as cargo, sold as property. That's an important part because here you could work towards freedom.
Yeah.
Here, you never had a chance for freedom, nor did your kids. Given new names and identities and severed from their families. So when we talk about things like separation of kids from families and they're like, this is not who we are, it's like, no, it is. It is, whether we're talking about indigenous folks for boarding schools. I don't mean Louis Chafee or Edson, right? Or whether we're talking about in slavery, right? These are things that were taking place. So again, when we talk about the trauma, and that's why I said before, when we talk about the anger being a natural response, makes sense. But it's also important to recognize that again, what happened, we took what was happening in Europe and brought a lot of it here. So again, the whipping, the branding, the cutting off ears, all these kind of things. When we think about lynchings, public spectacles, people got dressed up in their church clothes, their Sunday's best, went, had a picnic, sent postcards, did all of these things, right? But again, it's passed down. I'm skipping ahead of some things. We're gonna make sure you have these slides, because I told Shaz that there's no way I can get through as much as I need to get through, but I also think it's important to set the foundation. Recognizing again, cotton. I want you to go down here. Cotton was 60% of the total American economy. That means nobody had clean hands, whether you're from the north, wherever else. The total economy, 30% of white families in the Confederacy owned slaves, according to the census. So again, when we all say it's like, well, I don't know anybody who had any slave. Somebody did. It's 1 out of 3, right? All right. This last thing at the bottom is very important. So both of this, the first one is talking about small percentage of white men holding the majority of the wealth. That's also who could handle the power. But also at the bottom, white women could not own land, but what could they have? What could they have wealth in? Slave. Martha Washington,
Yes.
right? So again, this is how you kind of can still exploit white women through sexism, but also still kind of have them feel some sense of loyalty to the system. Are y'all following that?
Who was Nathaniel Hayward?
So he was a congressman
Oh.
back in the day and everything else. So when we talk about who's making the laws and everything else like that, we make laws that help our businesses, right? Last thing we'll show you all. So again, just look at some of these numbers when we talk about the cost of a slave. And so again, when we talk about it not being that much, so if we start at 1804, we're looking at $300, which is about $6,500. But by the time we get into, 1840s and things like that, and 1860s, you're looking at folks going for upwards of $50,000 to $65,000 in today's economy. And that's from one. Are y'all following that? So when we talk about wealth, we talk about foundations, and I'll talk about this when I used to be on the board of the Foundation for the Carolinas. When we talk about like foundations were created because once slavery was over, we had to have somewhere to redirect the wealth. Are we following that? But just recognize that again, we're not talking about something at a small scale. 40% of the Mecklenburg County population in 1860 was enslaved folks. This is the last one I'll show you. There's other ones. Look very quickly at where a lot of those slave cemeteries are. See which one grabs your attention. So again, we talk about the churches, right? So again, our hands have always been in these things, right? And our hands are in it today. The question is, what am I doing with my hands, right? Going back to that compassion and accountability, like part of pointing a lot of these things out is not for the purpose of like, oh man, I want people to sit here and I want you to stew. Work through whatever you have to, but when we talk about compassion and accountability, the part of it is figuring out, once I start to have new information, what do I do with it, right? How do I actually start to do some self-exploration? I talk about my own journey. I definitely have held my share of sexist beliefs in my life, right? And I can say that now as somebody who does a lot of advocacy alongside women and things like that. Middle school, I made plenty of homophobic jokes in 6th grade. Can't undo that. What I can do now as a 44-year-old man is show up and interrupt that when I see it now, right? Some of my thoughts around immigrants and things like that, when I was in middle school or whatever else, like again, because a lot of times my proximity, I wasn't thinking about it. I said a lot of things that, man, somebody like, I could blackmail you with that. I'm like, no, you can't, because I'll tell myself. But now I work alongside folks in our immigrant community to try to build partnerships and collaborate. And I say this, none of this is like me trying to like brag about myself, because that's not really what it is. It's simply saying that instead of being paralyzed by shame, because either I did something bad, I benefited from something bad, or whatever else like that, what I do is I take that information and start to figure out how can I start to try to do good now. Does that make sense? So if you all will indulge me, I know I'm breaking like all kinds of Presbyterian rules, because I know we're right. I know how we do it. Now, to be fair, we didn't start exactly at 6:30 either. Yeah.
we're fine.
Yeah. Well, what I'm about to do is I'm going to ask you all just to circle in little groups of 3, okay? And it's going to be a short conversation. This ain't going to be long, all right? So, the question I put on there is just recognize that this is a lot of heavy information. And again, that is not an exhaustive list by any means, right? I want you to think to yourself, what grabs your attention? But then separately, what is something that you have shifted your perspective over that you can easily acknowledge? One of the things I'll say lastly is people talk about the term Christian nationalism, right? Y'all heard that term? Right. And people are talking about like it's this new thing. Part of why I've done this with you all tonight is to help us recognize it's not. Are y'all following that? Like it is going. It's going back to our roots, right? So if you all want to take 7 minutes, all right, 7 minutes, all right, with each other.
Could be 6.
You can, if you just ice somebody out, yeah. What's that? Yes. I mean, you can do 2, it's fine, it doesn't matter, yeah, whatever works for you. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Shane. Yeah, that. All right, perfect.
You gotta turn it off.
What, guess what?
I just feel like, and I know it shouldn't feel this way, but like obviously it makes you feel like super guilty for like benefiting from that kind of like system. So it's but I like what you say at the end where it's like what do you do with that information? And that's what I'm kind of brewing over.
Yeah.
What do I do with it? That's not rhetorical. Like I'm actually kind of asking, like beyond just like voting or like whatever.
What I didn't know.
It does run through my head this whole that can run through my head. I'm not trying to sound negative, but that's how I felt. Like here,
I don't think that's.
yeah.
Yeah. If we're at least agents of conversation, where we come from.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like as a country, you mean? Like with our government.
I think just in terms of like, it's just what?
Yeah.
What?
Oh, for a long time. I even thought this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Watch the headline.
Oh my God.
Or make it harder for people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Watch. what's wrong with everybody being right? So like, it's a question.
Yeah.
Or the gerrymandering.
Gerrymandering, maybe talk about red lines. Urban renewal, big piece. Great job. Justin, what's Greg Gerald's book? No trespass, no trespass, what's it called?
Yes,
No trespass.
yes, like I say, I know.
Something like that.
Yeah, but it is like trespass. Yeah, how it's trespass.
Our trespass. It tells a very local story.
Yes, white churches and the taking of American neighborhoods.
And he even does like walk, I did a walk through. Free walk through. And through different policies.
Well, yeah, that reminds me of all the.
Gentrification yeah. So, you know, I think part of this Jewish activity is I think guilt can have its purpose.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to.
Yeah.
It's still like a package. That's, I mean, that's what has to start, right? Have a conversation. Well,
Yeah, it's just hard though. Like, I mean, like logically, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, 'cause, like logically, I know that like that's absolutely true. It takes like some time for your heart to kind of catch up to your mind.
Yeah.
You know, I hear all that. And I'm like, okay, yeah, but still feel like that. Like, in your heart. I don't know, but like definitely, like you're right. We're not gonna I'm not gonna change the world like by myself. You're not gonna no one is gonna do it all by themselves. It's just those little things that are like showing up here, having those conversations. Like that's
What other stories? Yeah, the more you know, there's a lot. And I think the church is trying to do, I think the church is trying to do with the windows, you know, and like
our church, right?
this church, yeah, like with the windows, thinking about who's there, taking that out and putting something in.
Oh yeah.
I love Richard Rohr. He has this great saying, the best principle of religion is that is practicing.
Oh yeah.
So like, when I think about that. Yeah.
I still think for me, maybe it was key.
Now that I know.
Finish your last thought.
I like I've never been to a church.
All right. All right.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, 7 more minutes.
I know, trust me, I know you need like 37 more minutes. All right, so, as I know people, some people run and grab kids and everything else like that.
Bye.
Yes, do it. Is anybody willing to share anything that came out of any of the conversation that you feel comfortable? Again, what is your own thoughts or anything else like that?
I'll just share what I shared with Annette and Harry that my nephew
Man,
that.
you know that I cheated on the timing.
My nephew that I announced was getting married on Saturday. His fiance is black. And, you know, I'm grateful that they're getting married in this day and age, but I mean, my sister actually had a conversation with them. Are you prepared to do, I mean, you know this better than anybody in this room, to deal with, you know,
Yeah.
what you're gonna have to deal with, the confrontation. And, you know, he was in Afghanistan during the war, so I mean, he's faced life and death, but this is, he's blind. I mean, it's always turned into him, so.
Right, right.
You didn't see that.
Details, right?
Details,
No,
yeah.
no, thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Absolutely. So, anybody else?
I would love to piggyback on that because we talked about in my group, you know, me and Carla got married and 2020 happened and you got this resurgence of race. And I remember we were both watching the TV and you had a lot of our communities kind of were like just rioting and burning stuff down. And I was like, yeah, why would you want to do it? Like, and it's the anger, it's the traumas tied to that. And even with us being in love, there's this, okay, but we don't understand our experiences. Our experiences are different. And I thought it was a really great learning experience for us early on in marriage. To your point, just because you love each other doesn't mean you grew up differently.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's what I always, my running joke is, my wife grew up going to church here. I grew up going to Little Rock, Missouri down the street. I was like, you know, we grew up going to church that were blocks apart physically, but miles apart demographically, right? But I think, you know, I think about that though. It's like, well, think about the Boston Tea Party. We celebrate that riot, right? Like it's only deemed that it's all who is doing it and who benefits from it that shapes how we tell the story. Are we following that? That's the difference between a patriot versus a looter. Is, do I feel like it benefited me? Sure. Sure. So it's just one of those things to recognize that, again, the lens through which we see things and the way they're communicated.
Yeah.
Right? Again, the way we talk about the Civil War, you know, and the fact that you can drive through certain parts of Pennsylvania and you'll see Confederate flags flying as well, right? And it's like, you could have been fighting for, oh, all right, never mind. It's something different, right? But again, just tying through that. The last thing I'll say, was I want to close this out, even going to that, you know, one of the things I always say is when I think about 9/11, it always tells me we know how to honor history the right way with the right victims and the right enemy, right? We don't fly ISIS flags. Nobody goes to Bin Laden Elementary School. You know, the 9/11 memorial only lifts up the victims, right? And so again, it says that we know when we identify with those people, we know how to honor it the correct way.
Yeah.
But it's sometimes also us working through our own potential shame because maybe my ancestors fought here. What I always tell people is I'm not telling you to get ashamed of your ancestors, right? Your family is your family. What I'm saying is we can also have an honest conversation about how that's been utilized in our society. And recognizing that for me, when I'm taking my kid to this Destination Imagination competition this weekend and we drive past the big Confederate flag headed into Burke County, I'm always used to it because I've done trainings up there and everything else too. That's a message to me, right? Whether it is to you or not may be different, but it's important for us to recognize those things. Again, what's done in Germany? They don't fly swastikas, we don't do those things. Obviously, there's a fight right now on these things, but it's important to recognize we can do it different. So I'll just simply say, I know Shell closed us out in prayer and everything else. I'm trusting them in that, right? But I hope that you all come back because like I said, we're building this thing week by week to equip each other to do this effectively. So I thank you for your patience and your time and energy tonight.
Let's pray. God, give us eyes to see, ears to hear, soft hearts, open hearts, that we may grow in knowledge and love of our neighbor and even our enemies. Help us to critique and model something better, that we may strive to live lives that follow in the way that Jesus paid and paved for us. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. I've been coming for a year.
I can give you.
Jordan.